Hello everyone, this is Lucky Chewy for Octopi Poker, and today I'm going to be reviewing a hand which was played between Alex Foxen and Adrian Mateos. So this hand took place during the PokerGo Cup in 2023. So let's take a look. There's 5 players left. We see there's sort of a shared chip lead, or at least a very close contention for it. Joe Chong on the button is the clear shortest stack. Alex, David Peters, Sean Winter, and Adrian kind of all have within striking range from one another. So folds to Alex, and he goes ahead and decides to open for a little over 3 big blinds with his ace-9 offsuit, and Adrian happily calls with 8-9 suited. Alex bets small on this queen 6-5 rainbow board. Adrian calls. The turn is a deuce bringing a flush draw. Alex checks. Adrian bets around a third of the pot. Alex calls, just on the strength of his ace-high. There's a lot of bluffs that could potentially exist in Adrian's range. Alex being someone who is very intuitive and savvy, even though Adrian is pretty much one of the top players in the game, you never know what kind of things may slip through the cracks and what someone like Alex might be aware of. Doesn't necessarily have to be an Oreo cookie type tell. It can just be a more subtle hesitation or a quick pull back from the bet after the chips are released. Could even just be a general feel, a body language thing. Things to always be aware of. It's always the case that, with great players, as much as they demand great respect, the nature of poker is such that no matter how great you are one day or one hand or one moment, in the very next moment, it's still on you to rise to the occasion and put your best foot forward. So nevertheless, Alex calls. Adrian fires it off, puts in a bet of just over 14 big blinds into a pot of just under 18. And Alex, after thinking it through for a while, makes the impressive hero call. Very nicely done. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the game theory heuristics that were at play here. And if we look at Alex's first in range, we can see that ace-9 off is very justifiably in there. Kind of a healthy limping range and a lot of desire to put some pressure on his opponent. We can see once facing the raise, Adrian's call with 8-9 suited is pretty comfortable. You can see here that this is quite common. Some of the weakest suited hands are folding, a lot of continuing with suited hands, not a whole lot of desire to stack off with weaker hands. Tens kind of can go either way. Jack starts to become a little bit too strong just to call with, and ace-jack kind of in that similar camp. We can see the bluffs coming from ace and king X, some queen X and jack X, so on and so forth. Jack 7, 10, 7 offsuit, kind of a nice heuristic to be aware of. Hands that fall just outside of the continuing range, so we can see jack 8 and 10, 8 offsuit, desire to call. The ones that are slightly too weak are often going to be the ones that like to bluff when the ranges are polarized. So with that in mind, we see Alex's strategy is to bet very often, mostly using a smaller bet size, particularly with a hand like ace-9, but we can see there's some desire to bet bigger, really kind of push the issue and get max value with our strongest top pair hands or an overpair like kings, and then choosing some straight draws or just some very weak hands that benefit from getting a fold right away. And we can see one of the reasons that this may be chosen is because Adrian calls a lot, right? He only folds 16% of the time, and the majority of his calling range is coming from unpaired hands. So we see a lot of hands with a backdoor flush draw, 3 to straight, 3 to a flush. Here, a lot of hands with a pair in them as well. Not a whole lot of raising going on. There is also the ICM component. They have that kind of shared chip disposition going on. So there's not necessarily a desire to stack off too light. But insofar as keeping Alex somewhat honest, there's some raising being desired by the solver with the stronger top pair hands, and then always finding a way to balance it. Hands like he had can very much fit in there. It's never not a bad thing to have equity when we raise. Raising these open-ended straight draws can be tricky. It's never a hand you really want to face a 3-bet with. We can see it doesn't really happen that often, and when we do get 3-bet, it's often by hands that have similar cards. In the event that occurs, the solver says to call it off. This may look rather, particularly on a stream, I imagine that social media would have its field day with somebody who opts for such a decision. Nevertheless, interesting theoretical idea to be made aware of. And as played on the turn, we see now a more common strategy on disconnected boards on the turn, especially for an out-of-position player. In a final table scenario, really just choosing a bigger bet, 75% of the pot, or checking, and Alex's hand is kind of not the right one to bluff with. It doesn't really have much equity outside of the overcard, and it beats a lot of the unpaired hands that Adrian could have. We see the hands that like to bluff are the ones that picked up a straight draw. Jack 10, kind of interesting. I think this is probably somewhat of a card matching idea with the Queen Jack and the Queen 10 holdings. And yeah, we see Ace 9 checked. And then Adrian went ahead and, justifiably with many hands in this range, slightly favoring hands with no draw or pairs for protection, some of the weakest king highs. He did go ahead and bet a third pot. And Alex's hand mostly folding in the theoretical model that we're exploring here. We can see some shoving going on from hands like 6-3, a pair and a gut shot, 2 pair, aces that have slow played, the little bit of hands that have a queen left in them. But, by and large, he's betting his strongest hands on the turn. So now that we've arrived here, hands like Ace 9 are sometimes continuing as a result of the range being relatively weak overall and being ahead of all the bluffs. So he calls, and we get the board pairing deuce on the river. And as the solver is recalling its information, we see that, interestingly, Alex is sometimes now using this stop and go type play, which we can see there's a lot of benefit to, and I'll show why in just a moment. But after check calling the turn, instead of using a large bet, quarter pot bet here is somewhat desired. As a result of kind of squeezing out max value with hands like jacks, 10s, 9s, and occasionally having these bluffs, these flush draws that didn't really want to bet the turn, at least all the time, didn't want to check shove all in, some of these straight draws as well. And what we see here is that when we check, our opponent, if they have a 6, is just checking back. And a 6 is, second pair, 25% of their range. So it's not going to be that uncommon that they end up in this point of the decision tree where they are making this particular turn bet and checking back the river. So Adrian did go ahead and bet. We can see 8-9 can kind of go either way. You see this a lot in river spots where ranges are wide. You can choose from a lot of different hands to bluff with. Practically speaking, you would want to rely on your general read on the opponent, your feel of the situation, any intangibles that might lead you one way or the other, because when decisions are close, in theory, what it means practically is that the door is kind of open for you to use your creativity in order to adjust the way that the parameters essentially are input into the machine that gives us this theoretical output. And any information that you may have about your opponent or about what you think is happening is going to be very significant in terms of leading you to ultimately make the best decision in that moment. So Adrian bets, and we can see that Ace 9 is in this particular model, not calling, and it's showing it's a relatively significant sort of downside to make that call. It's interesting. Let's see what the weakest hands that decide to call are. It appears like a 5. 5 is kind of the bottom end of that region. Occasionally ace king, very, very occasionally. But we have a lot of pairs. So the way that computers tend to think about these spots are that when you have a hand in your range that is objectively just weaker than most other hands, then barring any significant blocker effects, you'd rather the hand that is stronger to call with. And we can see here Ace 9. Where are we on the grid? So it's going to be somewhere here in the... It's towards the bottom of the range overall. Like it's not in the top half. Given that our opponent, at least again in this theoretical model we're exploring, is choosing to bluff relatively tactfully and doing so in a way which encourages us to be indifferent with hands like a 5 and to outright fold hands like an ace. And interestingly, a 5 is sometimes more favorable to call with than a 6. As I'm seeing it here, that's quite surprising to me. Let's see if we can identify why that might be. Okay, so it appears that they have Queen 5 more often than Queen 6. Presumably this has to do with either the flop or the turn strategy. We can jump back and check it out. Yeah, so I think it's just on the flop. Queen 6 raises more often than Queen 5. Makes sense. Just a stronger hand. That 6 pairing is quite bad for Queen 5, and it certainly makes sense to slow play a hand that, it's pretty close even as is. But I tend to get very granular with these ideas because I find them quite fascinating. The overall idea that to take away in terms of building a more effective strategy would be that you really want to just kind of bluff catch with your stronger hands and fold your weaker ones, barring any of those intangibles which may be at play. And, knowing Alex, having played against him a lot, and understanding a bit about his philosophy on poker, it would seem quite likely that there was something afoot. And he picked up on something, which ultimately led him to make this call, because it's not the type of hand or the type of situation that he's just going to blindly click call, but you can certainly see where the logic comes from, given that if you were to ramp up a lot of these hands that are unpaired and their bluffing frequency, then a lot of hands like Alex's would become exceptionally viable to call down with. So yeah, pretty cool hand. Two of the game's greatest players going at it, and hope y'all enjoyed. This is Lucky Chewy signing out for octopipoker.ai.